Hey everybody, welcome back to Planet Zoo. And today I'll be doing something slightly different from what I usually do. I'll be making a pack of blueprints, and there will be 5 blueprints and 5 matching time lapses in this video in total. You can download them in the description. I'll leave a workshop link there, and also that's basically it actually. There's not much else to introduce. Now for everybody who's wondering why I'm still not making a zoo, or why I'm still just building buildings in general. Well, for one, I was really afraid to start recording an actual franchise mode playthrough right from the get-go, because I noticed that everybody kept going bankrupt, and so did I, honestly. And thankfully yesterday the lady designer uploaded a tutorial showing how she managed to make a profit in franchise mode. So for now my plan is to try and make a profit in franchise mode, not record it because I don't want to get known for my failures, honestly. But as soon as I get something going that actually works, I would like to keep building from there and see what kind of zoo I can make in the remaining time that we have the beta. Now also, you know, at the end of the day, I want to build these buildings as a way to practice the scenery pieces. Everything in the game is new to me, and even though I might be used to the building system, I have no idea how the pieces work together, how to actually make buildings out of the themes. So I'm basically building these buildings as much as possible to try and come to grips with the scenery options that we have. Plus, and I know this is probably a bit sassy, but you know, this is coming from me, and I'm the person who's been making a ski resort in Planet Coaster, as well as modern apartments and Japanese gardens and all kinds of non-theme park related activities. And honestly, I see these games more as a general creative tool than something where you have to build exactly what the game intends to do. So yeah, I just like experimenting in these things and kind of stepping outside the boundaries of just what they're meant for. Plus that's kind of what I do, so especially in the beginning I wanted to focus on doing scenery as opposed to starting a franchise mode, which basically everyone on YouTube is doing. And I think if you want to see a franchise mode playthrough focused on gameplay and economics, there are lots of amazing channels out there. I just think that I'm not really the person who's best suited to do that sort of stuff. Alright, so now that that whole long intro is out of the way, let's actually talk about what I'm doing in this episode. So I'm going to be building a bunch of Indian blueprints, and the specific style that I was most inspired by is indo-saracenic architecture, which is actually a style of architecture that I have a folder of on my computer with a bunch of reference images and inspiration and information, just because I've always wanted to make a themed area in a theme park in Planet Coaster in this style. I was originally intending to include it in Fantasy Valley, but that never really developed into anything. It's just a style that I've always found really interesting and really beautiful. Although, I have to say, and this is going to be my short introduction of what this style actually means, it's a little bit controversial, at least political in a sense that a lot of architectural styles are political, because it's not entirely Indian, I would say. I mean, at the end of the day, Indian architecture is very diverse. There are different architectural styles throughout India. There have been different ones throughout history, and a lot of the architecture in India is a sort of eclectic mix of different styles of architecture. But this one specifically was created by British architects in the late 19th century, kind of as a response to the uprising in India in 1857, when Britain decided to very much change the way that it ruled the country. And I'm not going to make any political comments, because opening that whole colonization history is just a Pandora's box that I'm not going to open in a Planet Zoo video of all things. But they try to become more inclusive and try to adapt to the styles of India itself. And the kind of the mix that you get as a result is a synthesis of Mughal and Hindu, Islamic and European classical and Gothic traditions. And this eclectic architectural mix was very often used in buildings that were related to public institutions in some way, like post offices and hospitals, train stations, etc. And actually, to a large extent, it was also a symbol of Britain's rule over India, trying to establish its dominance and power with these really flamboyant and grand institutional buildings, trying to impress and sort of legitimize their rule almost. And it's interesting that even in post-independence India, a lot of these buildings have been put on the heritage list, and this architecture has also inspired a lot of, architecture actually created by Indians, because indo-saracenic architecture featured a lot of British architects. But yeah, it's overall, considering that whole history, regardless of politics, I love the mix of different architectural styles from all over the world that this style combines together. And I think it's a really cool kind of architectural style to build in Planet Zoo, because as soon as I actually saw the scenario during Gamescom, I realized that you could very well put the pieces together to make indo-saracenic buildings. So featuring all of the typical elements that it has, like onion domes, overhanging eaves, painted and Gothic-like arches, and many of these domed pavilions that Indian architecture is very much known for. It's just this really cool bunch of elements. And I should probably actually talk about the building which I'm building right here. This is going to be the longest time-lapse actually. This is a food court building, and this was my first kind of time that I messed around with this style, and it's definitely going to be the largest, most expensive and most flamboyant building out of the whole series. I was just trying to experiment as much as possible with the different pieces to see how you can put them together. So a lot of the architectural elements that I just talked about come back in this. The certain type of arches that you see, the domed pavilions on top of the building, and just in general it's a mix of different styles. And even overall, I think the general composition of the building is a bit European, which also kind of reflects the Indo-Saracenic history, being very much detailing from Indian and Islamic architecture, but at the same time very much composition from British architecture. Anyway, that's all for the food court. The next blueprint that I wanted to work on is a staff facility building, where I put all of the different staff facilities that you need to start a zoo in the game. And this was inspired by a bunch of staff facility buildings on the workshop already, which I figured is probably quite handy, because then all you need to do is plop down this one blueprint and you don't have to worry about putting a bunch of different staff facilities in the park. So it's kind of a good starting point. In general, I try to make these blueprints actually usable, because as a lot of people rightfully pointed out after the Japanese tea house build, it is pretty useless. So I want to make sure that at least these blueprints are usable and could potentially be put in place in a single park if you're going for an Indian style. And I'm not sure if these blueprints are actually going to survive into the full game. I'm building everything on the assumption that we're going to lose all of these blueprints eventually when the beta has ended. But if they do stay around, and if Frontier does figure out how to make the blueprints carry over into the full game, that would be absolutely brilliant, because then these blueprints will actually be quite useful, I think. Now, this building was just kind of inspired by a bazaar layout. So we have 2 rows of buildings on both sides, and an open area in the middle of it where all of the paths could connect. And this would also be an area where the guests of the park won't actually be able to go. So I'm not entirely sure if it's a good idea to make this as fancy as I'm making it right now, because it's essentially a backstage building. But I figured, you know, it's still a good exercise to get used to the pieces and see what you can actually do with it. So yeah, I decided to go a bit all out on theming this building, even though it wasn't really necessary. And hell, it's even stranger because it's very much an inwardly focused building. You know, these buildings are the nicest, I think, when you're looking at them from the inside, from the streets between the 2 buildings. And from the outside, there's actually a lot less detail and interest, so it's a bit curious in that regard. I guess if you really wanted to, you could actually take out some of the staff buildings and instead put some restaurants in it and make it some sort of entrance area or main street, some kind of plaza where guests could have their facilities. But in my case, I figured this would be a good setup to make a staff facility building, because a lot of them on the workshop so far are very functional. They're really just focused on being a starting point for the game and not necessarily on being the most beautiful buildings out there. So I thought it would be a cool experiment to try and at least make them look a bit nicer as well. And Yeah, I also just put 2 domed pavilions on top of either side of the buildings, which, if my pronunciation is somewhat decent at least, they're called chhatris, and they're a very common element in traditional Indian architecture, so it's something at least to give the buildings some flair. But aside from that, they're very standard, traditional, and kind of classical, honestly, galleries. And also, this was my first time experimenting with the letters in the game, which are absolutely amazing. They make it so much easier to make signs. I guess it'll be a bit unfortunate that all of the signs are going to have pretty much exactly the same fonts, but I really love the letters and just how flexible you are in placing them down. And the fact that we even got a bunch of extra characters, you can even make hashtags and stuff like that. Anyway, this is what they look like, just some photos. I'm adding a few pictures after every time-lapse, just to give you an idea of what these blueprints look like. But let's move on to the next one, which is going to be the greenhouse. Now, I really wanted to try and build a greenhouse as soon as I saw the glass pieces that are in the game, because they're really great and they're quite versatile as well. There are a bunch of different curved elements and shapes when it comes to these glass pieces. I don't think any of them are off-grid though, they are all pretty much wall or roof pieces. But even then, they're very flexible with all of the different shapes that they have, so that's really nice. And especially since Rudy made his lemur dome, I realized that I really wanted to experiment a bit with the glass pieces as well, so here goes. This will actually be a bit of an interesting mix between traditional architecture and very contemporary architecture, the kind of combination of old brick buildings and a glass part on top, which is always a bit controversial. I mean, in traditionalist circles on the internet, there's almost always so much going around about buildings like the Reichstag in Germany or the Hearst Tower in New York. You know the drill. These old buildings which they just put a bunch of glass on top of to add a new use to it. And personally, I kind of like it. Sometimes it's terrible, sometimes it's amazing, and I was at least trying my best to make this building be more on the amazing side. Even though it is quite small and it's really just me trying to mess around with the pieces, I think I was at least trying to reflect the shapes of the more traditional side of the building in the glass, so hence why you have this kind of vaulted arch shape to the glass. And I think, and maybe this is pushing it a bit, but my intended sort of pattern for the glass was also to kind of resemble a lotus flower with this pointed arch in the middle, which is the tallest, and then these lower arches kind of edging to the side. I think it kind of works by referring to the elements, referring to the shapes that are in the traditional part, in the glass part of the building. At least it isn't too dissonant. And it's always a good opportunity also to make use of different pieces in the set. Because in this building, for instance, I was using some of the tower pieces to make the front, which I hadn't really used so far because unfortunately these pieces are not recolorable. But even then, they do have a nice sandstone texture that I wanted to try and play around with. So this building was really my first foray into all of the sandstone pieces in the Indian theme and see what you can do with those. They're quite versatile, as you can see. There are so many different little elements, like different pillars and trims for roofs and spires, that really you can vary a lot in terms of what you're building. So I'm really a big fan of the diversity in pieces in these packs so far. Now the inside of this is going to be a bit of a mix. I was originally thinking that this would be a really cool building to house a small atrium for birds or something like that, but obviously that's not in the game, so my second idea was to make it an exhibit building with some greenhouse elements. I really love greenhouses in botanical gardens and such, where you can step into a tropical or desert biome, and this building is very similar to that generally. It was a way to put a bunch of palm trees in the middle of this and then mix it with some exhibits. I only fit 4 exhibits into this building because they're really expensive, which I didn't really realize before I built this, but it makes sense, totally. But it meant that I couldn't really go all out on this building, lest I not run out of money, which in fact I did at the end of construction of this one, so I had to stop. adding stuff to it at some point. But yeah, that's basically it. So this is what it looks like from the outside with the glass arches and the towers, and I think it's a decent mix of the two materials at least. I'm pretty happy with it. Now moving into a much smaller blueprint, this is going to be a small stall for food, which I figured was also quite necessary. So far a lot of the blueprints have been very large and very expensive. So I wanted to build something small that you could actually just plop down next to a road and turn into a snack corner or something like that. And for this one, I'm again bringing back the sandstone pieces to use a few more sandstone pieces that I hadn't used before. I'm actually using a domed pavilion for the side there and then putting some tower pieces on top of that, which I think works fairly well. And then there are a bunch of different decorations and trims on top of the walls. This building will be much simpler than some of the other ones. It's really just coming down to, you know, if you have a very simple shape, a very simple building, which is just a food stall, how can you add detail to it? What are the scenery pieces like? And it's especially a good building for stuff like clutter. So you can see me browsing a lot through the clutter section here. And I have to say, it's absolutely amazing. I think the Indian theme is probably my favorite in the game so far for all of the clutter options alone. Lots of baskets and sacks and even fruits and all kinds of things that you would need to build a marketplace, but these can really be used quite well to add to scenery of areas. I put a little rickshaw under the roof as well. I don't know, maybe in the plot of this building it could be used as some sort of delivery service. But, you know, given that I wanted to add a small roof to this building to make it a little bit less square and boxy, putting a rickshaw underneath it would be quite realistic, I guess. So that's it for this building. This is what this blueprint looks like in the end. And with that said, it's time to move on to the final blueprints of this whole video, which is going to be a toilet building, because I didn't have any toilets so far, and I've always forgotten about toilets, be it in my Parktech videos, or Planet Coaster videos, or Roller Coaster Tycoon 3 videos, or even Roller Coaster Tycoon videos. I just always forget about toilets, and in this case I'm gonna try to change my ways and become a better person, and not forget about toilets anymore. And my first step is to build an Indian toilet blueprint before I forget that. Actually, come think of it, my first blueprint in this game was a toilet, the Tudor toilets. But yeah, anyway, this is going to be a very simple building as well, not much bigger than a toilet building would realistically need to be, but I'm experimenting with a few different pieces in this one, mostly the limestone pieces to see how they work together with the other wall pieces. I should say I'm using a lot of painted walls here, because from my quote-unquote research of Google imaging a lot of Indian cities and architecture, I found that painted walls seem to be quite a common thing, so I ended up using painted walls on all of these blueprints in some way, and on this one I tried combining them with the limestone pieces to see how that works together, and there's even some brick as an extra detail to add some color into this building, lest it not be completely white and very monochrome. So I think these textures honestly work very well together, and it might just be because, you know, the game is quite new and we haven't seen a lot of pieces being used. I think in Planet Coaster, for instance, the fact that the game is a few years old does make it a bit more boring to see the same pieces over and over again, and everything here is still fresh, so that automatically kind of makes things look more interesting, I think. But still, a lot of these different textures from even the different themes in the game work really well together, I think. Given the fact that the limestone pieces come from the classic theme, the painted walls are a generic thing, I think, and then the other details are all from the Indian theme. But even so, they all fit very well together, I think. So I'm really happy about that. Although, to actually make these buildings look sufficiently Indian, I'm really focusing on the Indian theme when it comes to the minute details, like the windows and arches and brackets and things like that. I was actually considering for a while to put some sort of dome or decoration on top of the front of this building, but I've done that for every building in this pack so far, and I really wanted one building which is a bit more subdued and simple. Not to mention that domes are pretty expensive, you know, not in the game, but realistically speaking, so I needed to calm down a little bit on my dome fixation, so ended up not including one on this build. Also, this was my first time messing around with the vines in the game, and they're absolutely amazing. They're such an improvement over the Planet Coaster one, and it's a nice small touch to any building, I think, to make it look a bit more lived in and a bit more like an actual old building. And yeah, that is basically it for this blueprint. I put some foliage around it to make it look a bit more like it's actually in an Indian context, but that's about it. So yeah, I'd like to thank you guys for watching this video, and hopefully I'll see you in a Planet Zoo franchise video sometime soon. And if you want to check out any of the blueprints, just a reminder that they'll be down in the description. There will be a link to the workshop. Bye guys!